The night everything changed. I was dreaming of Martha's apple pie when the sky split open like God's own welding torch. 3:47 a.m. on my bedside clock. I'll never forget that number burned green against the darkness. The flash came first, white hot and angry, turning my bedroom window into a sheet of molten silver that made my eyes water and my heart skip a beat. Then the boom hit, not thunder, not lightning, but something that shook the farmhouse down to its bones and rattled every mason jar in Martha's old pantry. The cattle started bellowing like the devil himself had come calling, and I swear on my wife's grave that for one impossible moment the air itself seemed to hum with electricity that made my teeth ache. I threw on my boots and grabbed the flashlight, my hands shaking worse than they had since the funeral 6 months prior. Outside, the wheat field glowed with an orange fire that shouldn't have been there, crackling and spitting like a campfire made of stars. The smell hit me when I was halfway across the yard, something metallic and sweet, like copper pennies mixed with ozone after a summer storm. And there, where my prize wheat used to wave in the Kansas wind, lay a gash in the earth 20 feet long and smoking like hell's own chimney. My name is Carl Hendricks, and I've been working this patch of Kansas dirt for 43 years, same as my daddy did before me and his daddy before that. 600 acres of prime farmland stretching from Highway 36 clear down to Beaver Creek, coordinates 394712 N. 9820 235 W. If you want to get technical about it, I raise winter wheat mostly, some corn, and keep a small herd of Black Angus that Martha always said were prettier than anything Hollywood ever put on a movie screen. Used to be I could tell you everything happening on my land just by the sound the wind made through the grain, or the way the meadowlarks called at dawn. Hell, I could predict weather better than that fancy Doppler radar they got over in Salina, just by watching how the barn cats positioned themselves on the porch. But after what I found in that smoking crater on October 15, 2003, I realized I didn't know jack squat about anything at all. The world I thought I understood, where the biggest mysteries were whether corn prices would hold through winter, or if the Johnson's fence line was creeping onto my property, that world died the moment I stepped into that burned circle of earth and saw what was waiting for me. The crash site was like nothing I'd ever seen in 4 decades of farming this stubborn Kansas soil. The impact had carved out a depression roughly the size of my old grain silo, maybe 15 feet deep at the center, with edges that looked melted rather than broken. The earth itself had turned to glass in some places, black and smooth as a frozen pond, while chunks of my prize wheat lay scattered around like confetti after a tornado. Steam rose from the crater in wispy tendrils that smelled of burnt metal and something else, something organic and wrong that made my stomach turn over. My flashlight beam caught something metallic glinting near the far edge, half buried under a mound of dirt that had been thrown up by the impact. As I got closer, picking my way carefully around the glassy patches that crunched under my boots like thin ice, I could make out what looked like twisted pieces of aircraft fuselage, except the metal was too smooth, too perfect, with a surface that seemed to drink in my flashlight beam rather than reflect it. And there, pinned beneath the largest chunk of wreckage, was something that made my blood run cold and my rational mind slam on the brakes. Before we continue with this amazing story, tell us, from which country are you watching? Leave a comment and click the HYPE button or like so this video can reach even more people. Subscribe to the channel, you don't want to miss tomorrow's story. And now, let's move on. The body was small, maybe 4 feet tall. with limbs that seemed too delicate for any kind of manual labor, but perfectly proportioned in a way that made me think of Martha's china dolls. Its skin, if you could call it skin, had a translucent quality, like polished marble, with veins of silver running underneath that caught the firelight and pulsed with a rhythm that reminded me of a heartbeat, even though I was pretty damn sure it was stone dead. The head was larger than you'd expect for the body size, elongated like an upside-down teardrop, with features that were almost human but not quite, too refined, too perfect, like someone had taken a person and smoothed away all the rough edges that make us real. No hair, no visible ears, and eyes that were closed but seemed too large beneath the lids, as if they were designed to see things in darkness that would blind the rest of us. Its hands, visible where one arm extended from beneath the wreckage, had 6 fingers each, long and graceful as a pianist's, with what looked like small circular marks on each fingertip that reminded me of the whorls in a fingerprint. The strangest thing, though, was that, despite being pinned under God knows how much twisted metal, the body showed no signs of trauma, no cuts, no bruises, no broken bones that I could see. I should have called the authorities right then and there. Should have dialed 911 and let the professionals handle what was obviously way above my pay grade. But something held me back. Some instinct deeper than 40 years of following rules and doing what was expected of a Kansas wheat farmer. Maybe it was the way the creature looked so peaceful, like it was just sleeping after a long journey. Or maybe it was the memory of every government man who'd ever come onto my property with their clipboards and condescending attitudes, telling me how to farm land my family had worked for generations. Hell, maybe I was just a lonely old widower who'd been talking to his cattle for company and wasn't thinking straight after being woken up by what felt like the end of the world. Whatever the reason, I found myself checking the horizon for headlights, listening for the sound of approaching vehicles, and when I was satisfied we were still alone out there under the Kansas stars, I started figuring out how to move that wreckage and get a better look at what had fallen from the sky onto my farm. The largest piece of debris was wedged against the creature's torso, a chunk of that impossible smooth metal that felt warm to the touch despite having been exposed to the October night air for hours. It took me the better part of 2 hours to free the body, working mostly by feel since I didn't want to risk leaving my flashlight on too long and attracting attention from the highway. The metal pieces were lighter than they should have been, hollow sounding when I accidentally knocked them together, but stronger than anything I'd ever handled. I tried scratching one with my pocket knife and barely left a mark. When I finally managed to slide the creature out from under the wreckage, I was surprised by how little it weighed, maybe 60 pounds soaking wet. Light enough that I could carry it in my arms, like Martha used to carry our sleeping grandson when he was little. The body temperature was somewhere between warm and cool. Not quite human, but not cold, like you'd expect from something that had been dead for hours. As I lifted it, something fell from what looked like a belt or harness around its waist, a small cylindrical object about the size of a beer can, made of the same impossible metal as the ship, with symbols etched into its surface that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. I pocketed the cylinder without thinking, some part of my brain already treating it like evidence that needed to be preserved, and started the long walk back to the farmhouse with my impossible burden. The old horse barn had been empty since we'd sold the last of our quarter horses 5 years back. Nothing in there but hay bales, rusted equipment, and memories of better times when Martha and I used to ride the fence lines together on Sunday afternoons. It seemed like the right place to take my visitor, private, secure. and far enough from the house that I wouldn't have to explain anything to curious neighbors or unexpected visitors. I laid the body out on a clean horse blanket spread across the old workbench, positioning it carefully like I was tucking in a child for the night, then stepped back to really look at what I'd found. In the better light of the barn's overhead bulb, details I'd missed in the crater became obvious and somehow more disturbing. The creature's clothing, if that's what you'd call the form-fitting material that covered it from neck to toe, appeared to be made of the same stuff as its skin, seamless and organic, like it had grown rather than been manufactured. There were no visible seams, no buttons or zippers, nothing that suggested it could be removed, which made me wonder if what I was looking at was actually clothing at all, or just the natural state of whatever this thing was. The cylinder I'd picked up from the crash site sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I worked up the nerve to really examine it, those strange symbols seeming to mock me every time I walked past on my way to check the cattle or tend to the morning chores. It was maybe 6 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, perfectly smooth except for the markings that covered its entire surface like some kind of alien scripture. The symbols weren't carved into the metal, they seemed to exist just beneath the surface, visible but not tactile, like looking at writing through frosted glass. Some of them reminded me of mathematical equations, others looked almost like constellation maps, and a few could have been letters from some alphabet I'd never seen before. When I finally picked it up on that 3rd morning, coffee growing cold in my cup and October sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, the damn thing grew warm in my hands and started to emit a low humming sound that made my fillings ache. For just a moment, maybe 5 or 6 seconds, the symbols rearranged themselves into something that looked almost like English, words that seemed to spell out Guardian Protocol activated before shifting back into incomprehensible alien script. I nearly dropped the thing right there on the linoleum floor, my heart hammering like I'd just run a marathon. But something told me I was holding the key to understanding everything that had happened in that wheat field, everything that was about to change my quiet Kansas life forever. That night, lying in the bed I'd shared with Martha for 37 years, I stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what I'd gotten myself into. Outside my bedroom window, the crash site glowed with a faint phosphorescence that hadn't been there during the day, like someone had sprinkled fairy dust over the burnt earth. And every now and then I could swear I heard something that sounded like music, not quite a melody, more like a lullaby being hummed by someone whose vocal cords worked differently than human ones. The rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive and farming for 6 decades, kept insisting I should call someone, anyone, and hand over the whole mess to people who knew how to deal with impossible situations. But the other part of me, the part that had been talking to empty rooms since Martha passed and listening to the wind for answers to questions I didn't know how to ask, that part whispered that I'd been chosen for this, that everything in my life had led me to this moment when the universe decided to share one of its secrets with a lonely wheat farmer who'd lost his wife and didn't know what to do with the time he had left. As I finally drifted off to sleep, the cylinder warm in my nightstand drawer, and the creature waiting patiently in the barn like some kind of cosmic puzzle I was meant to solve, I realized that for the first time since Martha's funeral, I had a purpose again, something that mattered more than crop rotations and cattle prices and the slow, predictable rhythm of rural Kansas life. The 4th morning after the crash, I woke to find every electronic device in my house had gone haywire during the night. The digital clock on the microwave was blinking 88 to 88 in angry red numbers. My old transistor radio was picking up signals that sounded like whale songs mixed with computer static, and the television in the living room had somehow turned itself on and was displaying a screen full of those same impossible symbols I'd seen on the cylinder, shifting and flowing like living text across a blue background that hurt to look at directly. My cell phone, which I mostly kept around for emergencies and hardly ever used, was showing a battery level of 127% despite being unplugged all night, and when I tried to turn it off, the screen just displayed a single word in English: waiting. The strangest thing was that none of this felt threatening or malicious, more like someone was trying to get my attention, using the only tools they understood, the way you might tap on a window to wake someone up. I shuffled to the kitchen in my bathrobe and slippers, poured myself a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since midnight, and stared out the window toward the barn where my visitor lay silent and still as death. Something told me the light show in my living room wasn't a coincidence, that whatever intelligence had piloted that craft was still very much aware and trying to communicate in the only way it could. Walking across the yard to the barn felt different that morning, like the air itself was charged with possibility. The way it gets just before a thunderstorm, when every hair on your arms stands up and you can taste copper on your tongue. The October frost crunched under my boots with what sounded almost like musical notes, each step creating a small chime that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, and I noticed that the morning birds had gone completely silent, as if they were holding their breath and waiting for something important to happen. When I pushed open the barn door, the first thing that hit me was the smell, not the musty hay and old leather I was expecting, but something clean and metallic, like the air after lightning strikes close by. The creature lay exactly where I'd left it, on the workbench. But now there was a faint luminescence surrounding the body, a soft blue-white glow that reminded me of moonlight on fresh snow. And the symbols on the cylinder in my pocket were warm enough that I could feel them through the fabric of my jeans. As I approached the workbench, my footsteps echoing in the empty barn, I could swear I heard something that might have been breathing, slow and deliberate, though the chest beneath that strange organic clothing never moved. A quick pause in the story. I want to ask you, what do you think about this? Write it in the comments. Don't forget to click the HYPE button or LIKE so this story can reach more people. And subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow another story is waiting for you. Now let's continue. It was when I reached out to touch the creature's forehead, moved by some impulse I couldn't explain, that everything changed in ways I'm still trying to understand 30 years later. The moment my fingertips made contact with that translucent skin, the world exploded into light and sound and sensation that had no business existing in a Kansas hay barn on a Tuesday morning in October. I felt like I was falling upward through space and time, past stars that sang in harmonies that made my soul ache with longing, through nebulae that tasted like my grandmother's Sunday dinner and smelled like Martha's perfume on our wedding day. Images flashed through my mind faster than thought-fast cities of crystal and light stretching across alien horizons. Beings of pure energy dancing through dimensions I didn't have names for. And somewhere in the cosmic symphony of it all, a voice that spoke without words, communicating through emotion and memory rather than language. "We are the gardeners," the voice said, "or maybe I just understood it that way. And your world is one of our seedlings, growing toward something beautiful and terrible that you cannot yet imagine." The connection lasted maybe 10 seconds in real time, but felt like I'd lived entire lifetimes in the space between heartbeats. And when it ended, I found myself sitting on the barn floor, with tears streaming down my face, and the absolute certainty that nothing in my small Kansas life would ever be the same. The creature's eyes opened for the first time while I was still reeling from that initial contact. Large and dark as midnight sky, filled with distant stars. And I understood with a clarity that cut through me like winter wind that this being had been awake and aware the entire time, waiting patiently for me to be ready for what it had to share. There was no fear in those eyes, no pain despite being trapped in a body that was clearly dying, just an infinite sadness mixed with something that might have been hope, as if it had been searching for a very long time and had finally found what it was looking for. When it tried to speak, the sounds that came out were like nothing I'd ever heard, part whale song, part wind chimes, part the music that stars might make if they could sing, but somehow I understood every word, or at least the meaning behind them. "Guardian Carl," it said, and hearing my name spoken in that impossible voice made my heart hammer against my ribs like a caged bird. "We have been watching your species for what you would call millennia, tending the garden of your consciousness, hoping you would grow wise enough to join the greater community of worlds." The words formed in my mind like flower buds opening in fast forward, each concept blooming into understanding before I had time to doubt or question what I was hearing. What the being told me over the next hour, speaking in that strange telepathic language that bypassed my ears entirely and settled directly into my thoughts, was enough to rewrite everything I thought I knew about humanity's place in the universe. We were not alone, had never been alone, but were part of a vast network of consciousness that stretched across galaxies and dimensions like the nervous system of some cosmic organism too large to comprehend. The entity, who had no name in any language I could pronounce, but allowed me to think of him as Keeper, was one of thousands of guardians who had been stationed throughout the galaxy to watch over younger species as they developed, offering subtle guidance when necessary, but mostly just observing and protecting from threats they weren't yet equipped to handle. Earth, he explained with thoughts that tasted like starlight and ancient wisdom, was considered a critical nexus point in the development of conscious life. A world where the balance between creation and destruction was so delicate that even the smallest intervention could tip the sails toward either transcendence or extinction. His people, the Tenders as he called them, had been quietly working behind the scenes of human history for thousands of years, nudging us toward moments of enlightenment while trying to prevent us from destroying ourselves with the same curiosity and aggression that made us so valuable to the cosmic community. The crash, Keeper explained with emotions that felt like grief mixed with resignation, had not been an accident but a desperate attempt to reach Earth before his body finally succumbed to what he called temporal displacement syndrome, a condition that affected long-range scouts who spent too much time traveling between dimensions where time moved at different rates. He had been rushing back from a reconnaissance mission to the edge of our galaxy, carrying information about a threat that was approaching our solar system, when his navigation systems failed and his ship plowed into my wheat field like a falling star. The cylinder I'd been carrying around contained what he called a seed archive, genetic and cultural templates from dozens of worlds that had successfully navigated the transition from planetary consciousness to cosmic citizenship. Information that could help humanity avoid the mistakes that had doomed so many other promising species. But more than that, it contained the coordinates and communication protocols necessary to contact the greater community of worlds. The keys to a kingdom of knowledge and experience that could solve every problem humanity had ever faced if we could prove we were ready for such responsibility. the moral weight of what Keeper was offering me hit like a physical blow that left me gasping for breath in the dusty air of the barn. Here I was, a simple wheat farmer who'd never traveled more than 200 miles from the land where I was born, being asked to decide whether humanity deserved to know that we were part of something infinitely larger and more wonderful than anything we'd ever imagined. The knowledge in that cylinder could end hunger, cure disease, provide clean energy, and open up the stars themselves for exploration and colonization. But it could also trigger wars between nations scrambling to control alien technology, cause the collapse of every religion and government system on Earth, or worse yet, attract the attention of the very threats that Keeper's people had been working so hard to shield us from. Your species stands at a crossroads, Keeper's voice whispered in my mind. Weak but determined, between wisdom and madness, between joining the cosmic community as gardeners or being quarantined as a dangerous experiment that failed. The choice, he made clear, was not just mine to make, but mine to understand and then find a way to share with others who could make it properly. As the morning wore on and Keeper's energy began to fade, the glow around his body growing dimmer with each passing hour, I found myself face to face with a decision that no human being should ever have to make alone. The rational part of my brain screamed that I should contact the government, the military, the scientific community, anyone with the authority and expertise to handle something this monumentally important. But every time I reached for my phone or started toward the house to make that call, Keeper's memories of humanity's history flooded through our connection, images of wars fought over resources that could have been shared, of scientific discoveries used to build weapons instead of healing tools, of leaders who chose power over wisdom and fear over love. Your species is young, he explained when he saw the conflict tearing me apart, and youth often mistakes force for strength, possession for security. The great test is not whether you can reach for the stars, but whether you can be trusted not to set them on fire. Through his eyes, I saw humanity as the galactic community saw us, brilliant and creative and full of potential, but also violent and impulsive and dangerously unpredictable. A species that might become gardeners of the cosmos, or its greatest threat. The decision came to me not as a flash of insight, but as a slow dawn of understanding. The way Martha used to say, the best ideas always arrived quietly and without fanfare, settling into your heart like they'd always belonged there. I would keep Keeper's secret, would guard the knowledge in that cylinder until humanity proved it was ready to receive it wisely, but I wouldn't keep it forever. The being's memories had shown me glimpses of humans who carried within them the seeds of the Pleiades, wisdom we would need, scientists who put discovery before personal glory, leaders who chose service over power, ordinary people who faced extraordinary challenges with courage and compassion. Somewhere out there were individuals who could help guide humanity through the transition Keeper's people believed was coming. People who would know how to share cosmic truth without triggering cosmic catastrophe. My job, I realized, with the clarity that comes from making a choice that aligns with everything you believe about right and wrong, was to find those people and prepare them for a responsibility that would make my own burden seem light as morning mist. When I told Keeper what I had decided, his dying eyes filled with what I can only describe as profound relief. And for the first time since I'd found him in my wheat field, I saw something that might have been a smile cross those alien features. The hours that followed felt suspended outside normal time, like those precious moments between sleep and waking when the boundary between dreams and reality becomes thin as morning mist. Keeper's breathing, if you could call it breathing, became shallower with each passing minute, but his mental voice remained strong and clear, filling my head with stories and images that painted a picture of a universe so vast and beautiful that my small Kansas vocabulary had no words adequate to describe it. He showed me worlds where the oceans sang lullabies to moon-sized cities floating above their surface, planets where entire mountain ranges were living beings that thought in geological time and dreamed in colors that human eyes had never seen. I witnessed civilizations that had learned to grow their technology instead of manufacturing it. Species that communicated through shared symphonies of emotion and memory, and guardians like himself who had chosen to spend eternity watching over younger races like cosmic shepherds tending flocks of possibility. Through it all, I sat beside the workbench holding his six-fingered hand, feeling more connected to another living being than I had since Martha passed away. Understanding that I was receiving the greatest gift one conscious creature could give another, the truth about what lay beyond the boundaries of everything I thought I knew. As the afternoon sun slanted through the barn windows, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor, Keeper began to share memories that made my heart ache with a longing I couldn't name. He showed me Earth as his people saw it, not the angry, divided planet that dominated our news broadcasts, but a world pulsing with unrealized potential, teeming with minds that were on the verge of breakthrough discoveries that could reshape the cosmos itself. In hidden laboratories and forgotten libraries, in the dreams of children and the visions of artists, in the quiet moments when human beings reached beyond their limitations to touch something transcendent, Keeper's people could see the seeds of greatness that humanity didn't even know it possessed. Your species creates beauty from chaos, his voice whispered in my mind, accompanied by images of human achievements that took my breath away, not just the obvious ones, like art and music and literature, but subtler miracles like a mother's love healing a broken child, or strangers risking their lives to save people they'd never met, or scientists spending decades solving problems that would benefit generations not yet born. That gift is rarer in the cosmos than you might imagine, and more precious than all the technologies we could share with you. The cylinder in my pocket grew warmer as Keeper's life force continued to ebb, and gradually I began to understand that it was more than just a repository of information. It was a living link to the network of consciousness that connected every guardian in the galaxy, a communication device that would allow me to contact others of Keeper's kind when the time was right. The responsibility that came with that knowledge settled on my shoulders like a heavy coat, but not an unwelcome one. For the first time since Martha's funeral, I felt like my life had a purpose beyond just going through the motions of farming and aging and waiting to die. The weight of cosmic secrets might have crushed a younger man, but at 63, I'd learned that the heaviest burdens often carry within them the greatest blessings. Keeper seemed to sense this acceptance in me, and his mental voice took on a quality that reminded me of the way Martha used to sound when she was proud of something I'd done, warm and approving, and tinged with a kind of wonder that made me feel 10 feet tall and capable of anything. About the threat his people had discovered at the edge of our galaxy. Not an invasion in any traditional sense, but something far more subtle and dangerous, a form of cosmic consciousness that fed on the creative potential of younger species, leaving behind empty shells of civilizations that had forgotten how to dream or grow or change. The entity, which Keeper's people called the Silence, moved slowly through the galaxy like a cosmic cancer, not destroying worlds outright, but draining them of everything that made life worth living, turning vibrant cultures into hollow echoes of what they had once been. Earth's unique position at the intersection of several dimensional currents made it particularly vulnerable to this kind of attack, but also particularly valuable as a potential stronghold against the Silence's advance. The genetic and cultural templates stored in the cylinder weren't just tools for human advancement, they were weapons in a war most people didn't even know was being fought. Information that could help humanity develop the spiritual and psychological defenses necessary to resist an enemy that attacked consciousness itself rather than physical bodies. What struck me most about Keeper's revelations wasn't the scope of the threat we faced, but the faith he and his people had placed in humanity's potential to overcome it. Despite all our flaws and failures, despite the wars and hatred and environmental destruction that seemed to dominate our headlines, the galactic community saw something in us that we didn't always see in ourselves: resilience and creativity that could turn even our greatest weaknesses into sources of strength. Your species learns from suffering in ways that others cannot, Keeper explained. His mental voice now barely a whisper, but still filled with conviction. You transform pain into wisdom, fear into courage, loss into love. These are the qualities that will be needed in the battles to come, the weapons that the Silence cannot understand or counter. As he spoke, I felt echoes of Martha's death reverberating through our connection, and understood for the first time that even my grief had been preparation for this moment, teaching me to find meaning in loss and hope in despair. The technical aspects of the cylinder's operation came to me not as instruction but as intuitive understanding. The way you might suddenly remember how to ride a bicycle after years away from one. The device would remain dormant until humanity reached what Keeper called threshold consciousness, a point where enough individual humans had awakened to their cosmic citizenship that contact with the greater community could be safely established. My role was not to force this awakening, but to recognize it when it occurred and be ready to facilitate the connection when the time was right. The cylinder would guide me to others like myself, humans who had experienced their own moments of cosmic awareness and were struggling to understand their place in the larger picture, and together we would form a quiet network of guardians preparing humanity for its graduation into galactic society. It sounded impossibly vast and important when Keeper explained it. But as I sat there in my barn holding his dying hand, it also felt as natural as tending crops or caring for cattle. Just another kind of stewardship that farmers had been practicing for generations. The afternoon was fading into evening when Keeper began to share his most personal memories. Stories of other worlds where he had served as guardian. Other species he had watched grow from primitive awareness to cosmic consciousness. Some had succeeded brilliantly, transforming into beings of pure thought and energy who now served as shepherds for the next generation of emerging minds. Others had failed tragically, destroying themselves through fear and aggression, or allowing themselves to be consumed by the very technologies meant to liberate them. But all had been precious to him, each species as unique and valuable as a snowflake or a sunset. And I could feel the weight of countless eons of love and loss carried in his ancient consciousness. The hardest lesson for a guardian to learn, he told me, his mental voice now so faint I had to strain to hear it, is that we cannot save every world, cannot spare every species the pain of growing up. But the worlds we do save, the minds we do help awaken, they make all the sorrow worthwhile. In his memories, I saw glimpses of beings who had once been much like humans, struggling with the same questions of purpose and meaning that kept me awake at night, who had eventually learned to dance between the stars as easily as walking across a Kansas wheat field. As darkness settled over the farm and the first stars appeared in the October sky, Keeper's body began to undergo a transformation that was both heartbreaking and beautiful beyond description. The translucent skin started to glow more brightly, not with the harsh light of artificial illumination, but with something soft and warm that reminded me of candlelight in a cathedral. His breathing, which had been growing shallower all day, suddenly deepened and slowed, each breath lasting longer than seemed physically possible. And I realized that what I was witnessing was not death in any sense that humans understood it, but a kind of metamorphosis that my earthbound vocabulary had no words to describe. The symbols on the cylinder in my pocket responded to this change, growing warm enough that I could feel them pulsing in rhythm with Keeper's heartbeat. And gradually I understood that I was not just observing this transformation, but participating in it, becoming part of a process that had been repeated countless times across the galaxy whenever a guardian passed their responsibilities to a successor. The moment of actual transition arrived without fanfare, as quietly as sunrise breaking over the eastern horizon. One moment Keeper was there, his consciousness touching mine with thoughts too complex for words. And the next moment there was only silence and an empty body that seemed to be made of. But the silence wasn't empty, it was pregnant with possibility, filled with the echo of everything he had shared with me, and the promise of everything that was yet to come. I sat there for a long time, holding his still hand and watching as the glow around his body gradually faded into darkness, feeling simultaneously heartbroken and exhilarated, mourning the loss of a friend I had known for less than a day, and celebrating the birth of a purpose that would sustain me for the rest of my life. When I finally stood up from beside the workbench, my knees creaking like old barn doors and my back stiff from sitting in one position for hours, I understood that Carl Hendricks, the wheat farmer, had died in that barn along with Keeper, and someone new had been born, someone who carried within himself the seeds of humanity's cosmic future. The cylinder in my pocket had changed during Keeper's transformation, becoming lighter and warmer. And when I pulled it out to examine it in the barn's overhead light, I saw that the alien symbols had rearranged themselves into something that looked almost like a map, not of geographic locations, but of points of light scattered across what might have been a representation of human consciousness itself. Each point pulsed with its own rhythm and color, and somehow I knew, without being told, that they represented other humans who were ready to receive the knowledge I now carried, people whose minds had been touched by cosmic awareness and were unconsciously preparing for the role they would play in humanity's awakening. The map showed me that I wasn't alone in this impossible responsibility, that scattered across the earth were teachers and scientists and artists and dreamers who had experienced their own moments of transcendence, and were waiting for someone to help them understand what they had seen. My job was to find them, to gather them quietly and carefully into a network of guardians who would be ready when the time came to guide humanity through its graduation into galactic citizenship. The physical evidence of Keeper's presence began to fade, even as I watched, his body becoming translucent and then transparent, until finally there was nothing left on the workbench but a faint outline of light that lingered for a few moments before disappearing entirely. The wreckage of his ship had undergone a similar transformation while I sat vigil in the barn, dissolving into particles of light that scattered on the October wind like seeds waiting for the right season to sprout. By morning, I knew there would be no trace left of the crash that had brought cosmic truth to my Kansas farm, nothing but a circle of unusually fertile soil where my wheat would grow taller and stronger than anywhere else on the property. a reminder of the gift that had literally fallen from the stars into my care. The cylinder was the only physical proof that remained of the most important night in human history, and as I slipped it back into my pocket and prepared to walk back to the farmhouse under a sky full of stars that would never look the same to me again, I felt the weight and wonder of carrying humanity's future in my hands. The return to my empty house should have felt anticlimactic after everything that had happened in the barn. But instead it felt like coming home after a long journey to find everything familiar yet somehow changed by my absence. The electronic devices that had gone haywire that morning were all functioning normally now, displaying the correct time and picking up ordinary radio stations, as if Keeper's presence had been the source of the interference and his departure had restored the normal flow of terrestrial signals. I made myself a simple dinner of scrambled eggs and toast, food that tasted better than anything I'd eaten since Martha died, and sat at the kitchen table staring out the window toward the field where a starship had crashed and changed my life forever. The ordinary sounds of a Kansas night cricket chirping, wind rustling through the grain, cattle settling down for sleep seemed like a symphony of cosmic significance, each note part of a larger composition that stretched across galaxies and included every conscious being that had ever looked up at the stars and wondered if they were alone in the universe. That first night after Keeper's departure, I lay in bed listening to the silence and understanding that it would never be empty again. Somewhere in the darkness between sleeping and waking, I felt the first tentative touch of other minds across the planet brief. Uncertain contacts from people who had dreamed of starlight and awakened with tears on their cheeks. Men and women who had experienced moments of cosmic awareness and spent years trying to understand what they had felt. The network was already forming, I realized, drawn together by the same force that had brought Keeper to my wheat field and placed the future of human consciousness in the hands of a Kansas farmer, who had thought his most important decisions involved crop rotation and cattle feeding schedules. As I finally drifted off to sleep, the cylinder warm in the drawer of my nightstand and the memory of Keeper's faith in humanity glowing in my heart, like an ember waiting to kindle a fire, I understood that this was just the beginning, the first chapter in a story that would take generations to unfold completely, but would ultimately determine whether the human race would join the community of cosmic gardeners or remain forever trapped in the small, dark room of our own making. The tranquility of my cosmic awakening lasted exactly 72 hours before the outside world came knocking with steel-toed boots and government badges that made my blood run cold. It started with the phone calls, reporters from the Salina Journal asking about unusual atmospheric disturbances, reported by air traffic control at the regional airport, followed by calls from people claiming to represent the National Weather Service wanting to inspect my property for meteorite fragments. But the real wake-up call came on Friday morning when I looked out my kitchen window and saw 3 black SUVs parked along Highway 36, their tinted windows reflecting the October sunlight like dead eyes watching my every move. I'd been expecting this moment ever since Keeper dissolved into starlight. Had known in my gut that the electromagnetic pulse from his ship's crash would have registered on somebody's instruments. But seeing those vehicles lined up like mechanical vultures waiting for roadkill still made my hands shake as I poured my morning coffee. The cylinder in my nightstand drawer seemed to pulse with urgency, and I could feel the weight of cosmic responsibility pressing down on my shoulders like a lead blanket, reminding me that the future of human consciousness now depended on how well a Kansas wheat farmer could lie to his own government. The knock on my door came at exactly 10:30 a.m., delivered by two men in identical dark suits who looked like they'd been manufactured in the same factory that produced federal agents for television shows. Agent Morrison and Agent Clark, they called themselves, flashing badges from something called the Department of Atmospheric Anomaly Investigation. A name so generic it practically screamed classified Black Ops project. They were polite enough, speaking in the kind of measured tones that suggested extensive training in how to extract information from civilians, without technically breaking any laws, but their eyes were cold as January wind and twice as penetrating. Morrison did most of the talking, while Clark took notes in a leather portfolio, asking questions about unusual lights, electromagnetic interference, and whether I'd found any debris of unknown origin on my property in the past week. I played the role of confused farmer to the hilt, scratching my head and drawling about how the only unusual thing I'd noticed was my radio picking up some strange static. Probably just interference from those new cell towers they were putting up over in Russell. The lies came easier than I'd expected, rolling off my tongue like I'd been practicing them my whole life. But every word felt like a betrayal of something sacred, as if I were denying the existence of God while He stood right behind me, waiting to be acknowledged. What made the situation truly terrifying wasn't the agents themselves, but the equipment they brought with them, devices that looked like they'd been borrowed from a science fiction movie. All blinking lights and humming electronics that made the air around them shimmer with barely contained energy. They swept my property with instruments that detected everything from residual radiation to magnetic field fluctuations, walking in methodical grid patterns across my wheat field while I stood on the porch drinking coffee and trying to look like a man who had nothing more important to worry about than the price of grain futures. When they reached the spot where Keeper's ship had crashed, their equipment went absolutely berserk. Lights flashing and alarms chirping like electronic birds announcing the arrival of a predator. I watched Agent Clark's face go pale as he stared at his readings, then saw him whisper something urgent into Morrison's ear that made both men look at me with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for known terrorists or tax evaders. The fact that they found clear evidence of something extraordinary happening in my field but couldn't find any physical proof of what had caused it seemed to frustrate them beyond measure. And I realized that my decision to trust Keeper's dissolution process had probably saved both of us from a fate worse than death. The interrogation moved inside after they finished scanning the property, with Morrison settling into Martha's favorite armchair like he owned the place, while Clark positioned himself by the window, where he could watch for anyone trying to approach or escape. Their questions became more pointed and aggressive, focusing on my background, my family history, my military service record, and whether I'd ever been contacted by persons of interest from foreign governments or unusual organizations. They wanted to know about my wife's death, my financial situation, my mental health, and whether I'd been experiencing any unusual dreams or visions lately. Questions that came uncomfortably close to the truth and made me grateful for 40 years of practice at keeping my thoughts to myself. When Morrison suggested that I might be more comfortable discussing these matters at their regional office in Wichita, I knew we'd reached the point where cooperation was about to become mandatory rather than voluntary, and that whatever happened next would determine whether I lived long enough to fulfill the responsibility Keeper had entrusted to me. The cylinder in my bedroom seemed to pulse with warning, and I could feel the network of awakening minds across the planet watching through my eyes, waiting to see if their guardian would survive his first test. The moment of truth came when Agent Clark excused himself to use the bathroom, and Morrison leaned forward in Martha's chair with the kind of predatory smile that probably worked on people who didn't spend their lives dealing with bull market futures and commodity traders. "Carl," he said, using my first name like we were old friends, sharing a beer. "I'm going to be straight with you because I think you're the kind of man who appreciates honesty. We know something extraordinary happened on your property 3 nights ago. Something that registered on monitoring stations from here to Colorado Springs. We also know that you're probably scared and confused and maybe not sure who you can trust with information that could change the world." His words hit closer to home than I cared to admit, and for a moment I felt the terrible temptation to unburden myself, to hand over the cylinder and let someone else carry the weight of cosmic responsibility. But then I remembered Keeper's memories of other worlds where first contact had been handled by governments and military organizations. Worlds where fear and greed had turned gifts of enlightenment into weapons of destruction. And I knew that this moment would define not just my own fate, but the future of every conscious being on Earth. The lie I told Morrison in that moment was the most important words I'd ever spoken, more crucial than my wedding vows, or Martha's eulogy, or any promise I'd ever made to God or man. "Agent Morrison," I said, looking him straight in the eyes with all the sincerity I could muster. "I'm 63 years old, and I've been farming this land since before you were born. I've seen tornadoes that could pick up a house and set it down 3 counties over, hailstorms that could strip a wheat field bare in 10 minutes, and lightning that could turn sand into glass. But I have never, in all my years on this earth, seen anything that I couldn't explain with common sense and the knowledge passed down from my father and his father before him." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied my face, looking for the telltale signs of deception that probably worked on most people but had no effect on someone who'd spent decades negotiating with cattle buyers and grain elevator operators. "If something from outer space had crashed in my field," I continued, letting just the right amount of amused skepticism creep into my voice, "don't you think I'd be the first one calling the newspapers and trying to get on television? Hell, I could probably retire on the money I'd make selling the story to those tabloid magazines my late wife used to read at the grocery store checkout." Clark returned from the bathroom just as Morrison was deciding whether to arrest me or accept my story, and I could see the internal debate playing out on his face as he weighed the political consequences of detaining a 63-year-old farmer without concrete evidence against the risk of letting a potential security threat walk free. The fact that their instruments had detected clear signs of an extraordinary event but found no physical evidence to support their readings had put them in an impossible position. They knew something had happened, but they couldn't prove what or why. And taking action based on pure speculation would require explanations to superiors that might be difficult to provide. After another 20 minutes of increasingly circular questioning, during which I maintained my pose of confused but cooperative citizen who just wanted to get back to his harvest preparations, Morrison finally stood up and straightened his tie with the air of a man who'd decided to cut his losses and move on to more promising leads. "Mr. Hendricks," he said, handing me a business card with nothing but a phone number printed on expensive paper. "If you remember anything else about the events of Tuesday night, anything at all, I want you to call that number immediately. And I mean immediately, day or night, it doesn't matter." The relief I felt when those black SUVs finally pulled away from my property was so intense it made my knees buckle, and I had to sit down on the porch steps to keep from falling over as the magnitude of what had just happened crashed over me like a tidal wave. I had successfully lied to the federal government, had looked trained interrogators in the eye, and convinced them that the most important event in human history was nothing more than atmospheric interference. and the overactive imagination of air traffic controllers. But the victory felt hollow and bitter, tainted by the knowledge that I had betrayed something sacred in order to preserve it, had denied the existence of the very truth I'd been chosen to protect. The weight of cosmic responsibility, which had felt like a noble burden when Keeper first shared it with me, now seemed like a crushing load that might break my back before I could find others strong enough to help me carry it. As I sat there on the porch, watching the dust settle on Highway 36, the cylinder in my bedroom pulsing with what felt like disappointment, I began to understand that serving as guardian for humanity's cosmic awakening would require sacrifices I hadn't anticipated, prices I wasn't sure I was prepared to pay. The true cost of my deception became clear over the following days as I tried to re-establish contact with the network of awakening minds that had touched my consciousness the night after Keeper's transformation. The stress of the interrogation, the constant fear of surveillance, and the weight of carrying such a massive secret alone had created static in my thoughts that made it impossible to maintain the delicate telepathic connections that had seemed so natural just days before. Every time I tried to reach out to those distant points of light I'd seen on the cylinder's map, I encountered only silence and shadows, as if my fear had built walls around my consciousness that no external signal could penetrate. The cylinder itself seemed dimmer now, its alien symbols flickering weakly like a dying flashlight, and I began to worry that my moment of weakness, the temptation to confess everything to Morrison, had somehow damaged the delicate quantum mechanisms that made cosmic communication possible. The isolation was worse than the fear, a loneliness that made my grief for Martha seem insignificant by comparison, because I now carried knowledge that could transform the world but had no way to share it with the people who needed to hear it most. The final blow came 3 weeks after the agent's visit, when I woke one morning to find that my memory of Keeper's specific instructions had begun to fade like a dream upon waking, leaving behind only vague impressions and emotional echoes where once there had been crystal clear recollections of cosmic wisdom. The technical details of how the cylinder worked, the precise coordinates of the awakening minds I was supposed to contact, the specific protocols for establishing contact with the galactic community. All of it was slipping away like water through a broken dam, as if my human brain simply wasn't designed to retain information of such vast scope and importance for extended periods without regular reinforcement. I tried desperately to write down everything I could remember, filling notebook after notebook with fragmentary descriptions of alien technologies and philosophical concepts that seemed to lose their meaning even as I transcribed them. But the words on the page looked flat and lifeless compared to the living truth they were meant to preserve. By the time December snow covered my wheat field, I realized with horror that I was becoming just another crazy old farmer who claimed to have seen something extraordinary but couldn't provide any proof, couldn't even remember the details clearly enough to sound convincing when I tried to tell the story to myself in the privacy of my own mind. The cosmic responsibility I'd accepted so eagerly had become a cosmic joke, and I was both the butt of the joke and its unwilling teller, doomed to carry fragments of ultimate truth in a vessel too small and fragile to hold them safely. I'm writing this account on a February morning in 2024. 31 years after Keeper dissolved into starlight in my barn, and 28 years since the last time I tried to tell anyone what really happened in that Kansas wheat field. The doctors at the county hospital have a fancy name for what they think is wrong with me: early-stage dementia with episodes of confabulation, which is their polite way of saying, I'm a crazy old man who makes up stories about aliens to fill the gaps where my real memories used to be. My nephew, Tommy, bless his heart, moved me into this assisted living facility in Topeka after I started talking to empty rooms and leaving food out for visitors who never came. And most days I let the staff think he's right about my condition because it's easier than trying to explain cosmic truth to people whose biggest concern is whether Medicare will cover their blood pressure medication. But this morning something has changed. Something that makes me want to set the record straight one last time before whatever time I have left runs out like sand through an hourglass. The cylinder, which I've kept hidden in a hollowed-out copy of the family Bible for 3 decades, is warm against my chest where I've hung it on a chain like Martha's wedding ring. And for the first time since those federal agents left my farm, I can feel other minds stirring in the darkness. Tentative signals from awakened souls who've been waiting patiently for their guardian to remember who he was supposed to be. The hardest lesson I've learned in my 94 years on this earth is that truth doesn't diminish with age, it just gets harder to recognize under all the layers of doubt and disappointment that accumulate like dust on furniture in a house where nobody visits anymore. I spent the first 2 decades after Kepper's visit convinced that I was losing my mind, that the stress of Martha's death and the loneliness of farming had created elaborate fantasies to fill the emptiness in my life. I threw myself into conventional religion for a while, sitting in the front pew of the Methodist Church every Sunday and praying to a God who seemed smaller and more distant than the cosmic consciousness I thought I'd imagined. I even tried therapy, driving all the way to Wichita once a month to talk to a psychiatrist who prescribed pills that made my thoughts feel like they were wrapped in cotton and charged me $200 an hour for the privilege of being told that grief could manifest in many strange ways. But deep down, in the part of my soul that neither doctors nor preachers could reach, I knew that what I'd experienced was real, not because I had proof, but because it had changed me in ways that imaginary experiences simply couldn't achieve. The man who'd lived on that farm for 60 years had been satisfied with small concerns and local problems. But the man who emerged from that barn after Kika's transformation could never again look at a star-filled sky without feeling homesick for places he'd never been and longing for conversations with minds he'd barely touched. What strikes me most about humanity's relationship with the unknown is how desperately we want to encounter it and how thoroughly we sabotage ourselves when that encounter finally arrives. We build telescopes to search for signals from distant civilizations, then create bureaucracies designed to suppress or weaponize any evidence we might find. We write stories about benevolent aliens bringing gifts of wisdom to Earth, then train our military to shoot down anything that doesn't identify itself on the proper radio frequencies. We dream of transcending our earthly limitations and joining a cosmic community of enlightened beings. Then elect leaders who can't even figure out how to prevent our own species from destroying the only planet we've got. Keeper showed me glimpses of other worlds where first contact had gone wrong, civilizations that had turned gifts of knowledge into tools of oppression, species that had used cosmic technology to build bigger prisons instead of opening doorways to freedom, and I finally understood why the galactic community approaches younger races with such patience and caution. We're like children playing with matches in a room full of gasoline, convinced that fire is the answer to all our problems while remaining oblivious to our own capacity for self-destruction. The universe isn't withholding its secrets from us out of cruelty or indifference. It's waiting for us to grow wise enough to handle those secrets without burning down everything beautiful and irreplaceable in our eagerness to possess what we don't yet comprehend. This morning, as I sit by the window of my room in this sterile building, watching snow fall on the parking lot where they've planted trees that will never grow tall enough to block out the sky, I can feel the network stirring again like flowers responding to the first warm day of spring. The cylinder around my neck is humming with the same frequency I remember from that October night in 2003. And suddenly the symbols are clear in my mind again. The map of awakening consciousness spread across the planet like points of light in a vast darkness. They're out there, the teachers, the healers, the dreamers, the quiet revolutionaries who've experienced their own moments of cosmic contact and spent years thinking they were alone in their knowledge. Scientists who've had breakthrough insights that came from sources they couldn't identify. Artists who've created works that channel truths larger than their own experience. Ordinary people who've looked into the eyes of dying loved ones and seen something infinite looking back. The network was never broken. I realize now I was just too afraid and too isolated to hear the frequency. Too wrapped up in my own doubt and grief to recognize the connections that were always there, waiting for me to remember how to listen. Somewhere in the gentle hum of the cylinder against my chest, I can hear Keeper's voice again, patient and loving as a parent teaching a child to walk, reminding me that the universe operates on a timeline measured in geological ages and that my small human impatience was just part of the growing pains every guardian experiences. Tonight, when the nurses have finished their final rounds and the hallways have settled into the quiet rhythm of elderly breathing and distant dreams, I'm going to take the cylinder out to the courtyard garden behind this building and do what I should have done 30 years ago. Open myself to the network and trust that humanity is finally ready for the truth I've been carrying like a stone in my heart. Maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe I'll just be a crazy old man talking to empty air under a February sky. But I've spent too many years protecting a secret that was never meant to be hoarded by one person. The snow has stopped falling and the clouds are clearing, revealing stars that seem closer tonight than they've appeared in decades. And I can feel something vast and patient stirring in the darkness between worlds. Something that has been watching and waiting and hoping for the day when Earth's children would be ready to come home. Whatever happens next, whether I find the words to awaken the network or simply fade into the cosmic background like an old rad signal, growing weak with distance, I know that this is not the end but the beginning. The moment when humanity either takes its first tentative step toward cosmic citizenship or retreats once more into the small, safe cage of its own fear. As I write these final words, the cylinder is growing warm enough to feel like a heartbeat against my chest. And somewhere in the vast symphony of space and time, I can hear the faint but unmistakable sound of distant voices calling my name, calling all our names, inviting us to join the dance of consciousness that connects every awakened soul across the endless expanse of creation. Patient as starlight and eternal as the love that binds all things together in the cosmic garden we're finally ready to tend. If this story moved you or made you reflect, click the HYPE button or like and write in the comments what impressed you the most. We want to hear your opinion. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and see you in the next story.